The New Orleans Saints adapting without Eric McCoy will decide games versus Falcons. Ladies and gentlemen, Ross Jackson, Locked On Saints, and a crossover edition. This is like the Ninja Turtles mixing up with the Power Rangers to fight crime and solve mysteries. Aaron Freeman from the Atlanta Falcons podcast, Locked On Falcons. So they're going to tell each side of the story. Okay, very important. I like these. I like this idea, this crossover. You know, like to hear, because it's one thing to just hear from the Saints side, but you do wonder, like, how do the Falcons approach this game? What do they think about their own injury concerns today? We will hear about that. Again, Aaron Freeman, Ross Jackson, and the face of the franchise. Let's do it.
The Falcons are going to have to overcome some injuries on their offensive line.
I think the New Orleans Saints are going to be the ones having to overcome some injuries on their offensive line.
Oh, shit. The hell was that?
You are Locked On NFL Crossover.
Graphics,
Part of the
intro.
Locked On Podcast Network.
Damn. All right.
Your team every day.
God, dog.
Welcome back, everyone, to a crossover Thursday here on the Locked On Falcons and Locked On Saints podcast. And of course, crossover Thursday is presented by Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com. You're taking shots at each other. How are you doing today, Ross? On this
I'm good.
Let's get
man.
into
I'm
the
ready to get
game.
started.
What are we doing here?
What's going on in New Orleans? What are the biggest stories heading into this week 4 matchup?
Yeah, look,
Well, the biggest story, Aaron, is the fact that our offensive line is in complete shambles. The biggest story is that Eric McCoy's groin ripped off the bone. He had surgery. He's out for 6 to 8 weeks. We have an absolute mash unit on the offensive line. Lucas Patrick, who knows where he'll be playing. No idea what's going to happen. Cesar Ruiz might be hurt. Alvin Kamara is back at practice, thank God, but he was hurt. A little hip pointer, rib situation. The high-flying Saints offense that we saw the first 2 weeks was absolutely just destroyed against the Eagles. Can we find our former form? Or will we struggle again now that the blueprint is out on how to stop the Saints?
look, this should sound familiar, Aaron. I think the biggest thing for the New Orleans Saints, particularly over on the offensive side, which is where I'll start here, is that they don't have their starting center, Eric McCoy, for at least the next 4 weeks, with the expectation being 6 to 8 weeks. Suffered a groin injury against the Philadelphia Eagles in their week 3 loss to the Eagles just last weekend. And he's going to have surgery. And he's out. And that's going to be a big deal for New Orleans because that offensive line struggled a lot without him once he was out up against the Philadelphia Eagles. But now the Saints have a week to prepare to see if they're able to train somebody up to get ready to go at center. But as you know, anytime that you lose a center on your offensive line, it has major ripple effects. And the Saints got a really bad taste of that last week against the Philadelphia Eagles.
So I'm curious, Ross, who's going to step in? I think Lucas Patrick stepped in last
This week, it sounds like Lucas Patrick is again going to be center.
week.
Yep.
I know Cesar Ruiz has some experience playing that position, but I understand he might be going through his injury of his own. So is it going to be Lucas Patrick kicking over from left guard to center?
I think it's all going to come down to whether or not right guard Cesar Ruiz is available. Cesar left the game for one play against Philly with an ankle injury, but this week ended up missing practice on Wednesday with a knee injury. So it's a different situation that he's dealing with. Now, that was the Wednesday injury report. As you know, a lot can change from Wednesday to Thursday, from Thursday to Friday. So we'll see what happens.
No
But
doubt.
if Cesar Ruiz is good to go, then I would expect that, yes, Lucas Patrick kicks inside to center. And then you might see one of the other veteran backups end up plugging in at left guard. That could be veteran Oli Udoh. That could be
Udoh's who filled in last week.
longtime Saint Landon Young. Or that could be second year, 4th round draft pick from New Orleans, Nick Saldiveri. We'll see which one of those guys
Saldiveri filled in whenever Ruiz got hurt and missed the play
that it is. But
at right guard.
where it gets really complicated is if Cesar Ruiz ends up also being out.
That's bad news bears.
Then the Saints are going to have to not only replace a center, but also replace each of their left guard spots. So in that case, it might be wise to leave Lucas Patrick at left guard, maybe plug in Oli Udoh, Landon Young, Nick Saldiveri, whomever at right guard, and then actually move Shane Lemieux, who they moved up from, former New York Giant, former Oregon Duck, if I remember correctly, before that. So very experienced in the wide zone run system and all those things. Not a lot of experience in the NFL at center, but the Saints have worked him out there over the course of training camp and preseason. So he could potentially be moved in at center. If Ruiz also misses, that's where things can get a little bit complicated for New Orleans.
So is it fair to ask that I've made a lot of fun on Trevor Penning's expense on Locked On Falcons over the years? Is it fair to ask that the Saints may be potentially down their two best offensive linemen if both Ruiz and McCoy? How you feel about the rest of the
you could argue Fuaga has been our second best offensive lineman next to McCoy. You could argue, I mean, Fuaga's been incredible.
Starting three, I guess you could say elsewhere.
Yeah, I would say that they're probably down in this case.
McCoy is the most important for sure. Like McCoy is the most important lineman on the team.
Maybe I would say maybe two of their four best, right? Because like I have to put Trevor Penning sort of in his own conversation. But man. Look, rookie left tackle Taliesin Fuaga has been fantastic, and really Eric McCoy and Lucas Patrick, they for a little while.
They definitely could be down two of their top five, no doubt.
With the highest graded offensive lineman according to Pro Football Focus. Now that all depends upon how.
Yeah, he was also graded at left guard.
How much weight you put into Pro Football Focus. But I don't know if I would say they're two best because Lucas Patrick has kind of been that second best guy. But Cesar Ruiz kind of hovers there as either the third or fourth best guy, even though I do have some trouble putting him up above Taliesin Fuaga, the rookie starting at left tackle. So I think the biggest thing, though, is that without a doubt, they're without their best offensive lineman in Eric McCoy.
So, Ross, let's flip the script to the defensive side of the ball. What's sort of the big issue that the Saints are dealing with this week, heading into this Week 4 matchup?
Much like the injury on the offensive line hangs in the balance or makes the run game hang in the balance for the offense, which is where everything is predicated from with this New Orleans Saints wide zone offense, which you're familiar with over in Atlanta, of course, how important that run game is. The Saints also struggled big time against the run up against the Philadelphia Eagles.
Real big. Talk about struggle. Struggle is an understatement.
Particularly late in the game. Now, the offense didn't stay on the field a ton. The defense was maybe winded, all these other things you might want to throw out there. But nonetheless, they just didn't hold up in the run game.
Philadelphia also has like a top 5 offensive line, so you can throw that in there as well.
147 rushing yards surrendered to Saquon Barkley. Bijan Robinson is licking his chops. Look.
Okay, hold on now. It's not apples and hold on. It's not one for one. It's a lot of context. Eagles, top 5-ish offensive line. Atlanta, not a good offensive line right now. Injuries all over the shop. We saw what that caused against the Kansas City Chiefs, where Bijan was held to 3 yards to carry, maybe. So it's not exactly Saquon did good, so Bijan will do good.
Looking at that and getting ready for this New Orleans Saints defense. Now, the Saints run defense was really, really good the first 2 weeks because teams had to abandon the run game because of how effective their offense was, scoring 91 points, the second most in NFL history, tied for the second most in NFL history over the course of the first.
That doesn't make a run. That doesn't skew stat. It's like another example of why I always say you have to look at like weighted analytics or whatever, because when you have a situation like that and a team has to abandon the run, if you just look at like yards rushing, obviously it's going to be low. So you got to look at DVOA or some advanced analytic that does weight per the efficiency or success rate per run, so you can see how they did do against the run on those per plays, not so much like the entire game, which is another reason why I kept trying to explain to Colin Cowherd and Kurt Benkert why the Carolina Panthers graded out as a top 5 passing defense last season if you just looked at passing yards allowed, because they were losing every single game. So why would their opponents be passing, right? If you just look at the shallow stats, you can kind of get mixed up on that.
2 games. So if the Saints offense gets back to clicking, which will be tough without that offensive line healthy, then that's where I think the run game gets aided. But if this ends up being a close game between New Orleans and Atlanta, just like it was between New Orleans and Philadelphia, Atlanta's run game could be the thing that ends up being the difference in this game. So the Saints run defense has to be the big question mark.
Well, it is fascinating talking with you, Ross, because are you talking about the Saints or are you talking about the Falcons? Because
I know, right?
It is kind of funny because before the season, we were saying that the Falcons and Saints are basically in the exact same situation, like just kind of how they have built the teams and question mark where are the question marks, defensive oriented head coaches who are kind of marred by bad coaching records. You've got first year offensive coordinators for each team, young, innovative offensive coordinators. You've got an older veteran quarterback. You've got younger playmakers. It was just so similar. And it's funny that this matchup, so similar. 2 offensive linemen down as of right now for the Falcons. Huge deal, right? Like we just talked about. Saints, at least 1, possibly 2 offensive linemen injured. Everything, and they both want to do the same thing. It is really a mirror matchup.
A lot of the same issues that you're talking about. Saquon Barkley running all over you. Are you talking about the Saints or talking about the Falcons? I'm so confused here. But, curious about the rest of the Saints defense. Is this, outside of that maybe porous run defense, does this feel like a typical Dennis Allen led defense through 3 games at this point?
Yeah, defense is sweet. Saints defense is really, really good. Right now, top 5 DVOA, really good at every phase. It's a super solid defense
this season.
I would say absolutely yes. I think that they've given up some explosive plays because of lack of tackling and things like that, running into each other. But we've seen that from this Dennis Allen defense before too. That's kind of been the moments where they struggle, or the moments where things are just completely out of sync for them. That's what we saw against Philly. We've seen that in other games as well. But on a more consistent basis, this is still very much a Dennis Allen defense. Even last week when they struggled, they still took the ball away multiple times. They had the punt block, which is something that the Saints have, done twice now this season already, and everything. And so I think that that is, and of course is a history part of this rivalry between the Saints and the Falcons, is blocking punts. And so I think that those things are still things. Sorry, it's relevant, right? We got to tell the whole story. It's editorial. It's editorial.
My mind went to that game, and I was just like, I will never escape that game ever in my life.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Continue.
I'm sorry. It's editorial responsibility.
I went to a dark place.
Come back. Come to the light. So I would say that the Dennis Allen defense is still very much a Dennis Allen defense, especially when it comes to the passing game and stuff like that. Some of that's going to be clouded by some of the explosive plays they've given up so far this season. But for the most part, they're picking passes off, they're forcing turnovers, they're not allowing red zone scores, things like that. Those are the things that you typically want to see from a Dennis Allen defense, and we've seen that so far this year for the majority of their performance.
Okay. Well, we're going to continue this conversation talking about the big stories for the Atlanta Falcons. And don't worry, guys. It's not that your podcast has skipped the beat and it's repeating the same narratives, but it's a lot of similar issues, and that the Falcons will have to overcome with injuries on their front and being able to stop the run. And we'll get into all of that as we continue today's Crossover Thursday. But let's get into the biggest stories for the Atlanta Falcons. And Ross, it's going to be repeat. It's just a slightly different flavor.
So interesting. Yeah, it's so funny.
The Saints are dealing with, but it's being the big question for me going into this, and the biggest story for the offense is, can they essentially establish the run given some of the injuries they're dealing with on their offensive line? They're down.
All right, so here's the deal. When you've got 2 teams that are similarly built, that are dealing with similar issues, the question simply becomes, which team can take advantage of the other team's issues? If you look at every metric right now, the Saints are better off defensively to stop the Falcons than the Falcons are to stop the Saints. Now, that does not mean the Saints necessarily are going to cakewalk to a win. You still have to score points to win. But what this does tell me is that this more than likely is going to be a low-scoring, slugfest kind of grinded out game. I think it'll be very similar to the Philadelphia game. Now, it might not be 15-12, but I think you're going to see a lot of punting. I think you're going to see a lot of kind of just 3 yards in the cloud of dust, a lot of disjointedment on both sides. I think you're going to see a lot of 2-yard runs and incomplete passes and checkdowns and whatnot. And it will come down to those high leverage moments, whether it's a turnover or, a timely 3-and-out or a timely stop or a red zone stop or what have you. So the Falcons are capable, obviously, but if we're looking at this strictly from a matchup, strictly from an advantage point, I think the Saints do come into this game with the advantage.
Their starting center, Drew Dalman, on a IR with a high ankle sprain as opposed to a groin injury. And their right tackle, Caleb McGarry, is not officially out listed.
Yeah, McGarry strained his MCL. He's not officially out, but it's hard to imagine him playing.
Is out for this upcoming game. He's officially day-to-day dealing with an MCL sprain, but I would be utterly shocked if he played this weekend. He had an MCL injury last year and missed 3 games. Now,
you could also argue the Falcons are more injured. I mean, the fact that they have 2 offensive linemen flat out, pretty much. We'll just say McGarry's out. And the Saints have McCoy out. Like, yeah, the Saints do have to move some pieces around, but they're not flat out they don't, it's different. It's different that Patrick has to move over, so then we have another guy to fill in the left guard. That is a different situation than 2 of your starters out. So the Falcons come into this more injured than the Saints, or maybe not more injured, but their injuries are more impactful, and with a less suited to take advantage of the Saints injuries than the Saints are of the Falcons injuries. So, I mean, those are 2 points, I think, towards the Saints.
Maybe the severity is slightly different, and so this one he can come back, in a shorter timetable than that. But I would be floored if he plays this week. And so you're losing a big potential part of your run game in terms of McGarry. Him and Chris Lindstrom on the right side of that offensive line make it go. The Falcons will be placing Dahlman with Ryan Nuzul, who's been around the last couple of years, been solid at times when he's been forced to step on the field, but is not the same player as Drew Dahlman. And the same thing with Storm Norton, who did a solid job as a replacement for McGarry last year, but is not bringing the same sort of oomph in the run game, especially in the outside zone scheme that the Falcons love to run, just like the New Orleans Saints. And so the question is going to be, can the Falcons be as committed to that run scheme against the Saints this week if they don't necessarily have the horses to run it? And if they can't be as committed, can they diversify their run games, mix in some inside zone, some other run things? Can they supplement the run game with the quick passing game?
Okay, so we kind of have the answer to that. The Saints are number 3 in the NFL against a team's wide receiver number 1. Okay. The Falcons are like 20th in the NFL. So if both teams are like, okay, the run is not going to work, so we need to supplement that with getting the ball to our best receiver. The Saints do have the advantage also in being able to stop that. So Drake London, in this example, would be relatively stymied, whereas Chris Olave seemingly would be able to kind of do what he wanted. So that's another advantage for the Saints. So now we're starting to peel the onion back. Okay. We understand that both teams want to run the football. Atlanta's more injured on the offensive line, or more impactful injuries on the offensive line than the Saints. Then if you go to the next level, running's not going to work. Now we got to throw. Number 1, if the offensive line is injured for both teams, which it is, which quarterback do you have more faith in to deal with the pressure? I would say Derek Carr. Kirk Cousins has not looked physically at his highest level. He's looked like he's still dealing with, whatever remnants of the injury. He doesn't look like himself physically. Carr has been good versus pressure recently. Okay, and then we just talked about the wide receivers. It looks like the path to victory for the Falcons, if they can't run the football, is through Darnell Mooney, which I can't even believe I'm saying, or Ray McCloud. Because the Falcons or the Saints do struggle against wide receiver 2s. They're really good against wide receiver 1s. They're like 20th or 22nd or something against wide receiver 2s. The Falcons are really good against wide receiver 2s. So more than likely, this will be a Chris Olave game for the Saints and a whoever you believe is the second receiver for the Falcons. Whereas it won't be a Drake London game and it won't be a Rashid Shaheed game.
Right? Where it's essentially the idea of, hey, if you're trying to get 5 or 6 yards on the ground, who cares if it's a pass or a run play? As long as you get 5 or 6 yards, you can still keep the offense on schedule. But, that may involve screens and swings and all various things on the perimeter. But can you do that effectively against a Saints defense that has big physical corners that love to play press coverage? The Falcons struggled with that last week against the Chiefs in the second half of the game, trying to dial up some of those plays to Darnell Mooney and Bijan Robinson. And the Chiefs were able to blow up those plays because they weren't necessarily getting the blocking on the edge. And that's going to be a challenge for the Falcons going into this week. So can the Falcons run the football? And if they can't run the football, can they find other ways to keep this offense on schedule and keep them in manageable situations so that their third down woes that have made them like bottom 3 in the NFL in terms of converting third downs doesn't rear its ugly head against this Saints defense and them not being able to sustain drives and be able to put points on the board. So that's the big story for the Falcons offense this week.
Yeah, for sure. It does sound very, very familiar. It sounds almost the exact same in terms of what New Orleans is dealing with. I think that you're looking at the same thing in terms of like trying to use the short passing game as an extension of the run game and the way that all ends up working out. How do you feel this, I guess my question is like, how do you feel about replacing a center when you also have a new quarterback in the building at the same time? I mean, it's Kirk Cousins. He's been doing it for a long time. There's nothing
We do know that Kirk Cousins is a agent of routine. He does like routine. He does like things to be the same. So a center switch would seemingly impact someone like Cousins a lot more than other people.
Hasn't seen. So at least there's that. But do you feel like that complicates the issue at all to where you have like a new quarterback with a new offensive system and now down the center for the team?
Yeah, it's going to be a challenge. Like in the Chiefs game, once the Chiefs saw that the Falcon center was out, they started dialing up pressure, and that created problems.
Yeah, the Chiefs absolutely wrecked. Once, I mean, it was immediate. The game completely swung.
They were able to get some of that pressure through the A gap and disrupt the offense, and that forced the Falcons to do the thing that they don't really want to do, which is keep Bijan Robinson in to protect. And if he's blocking, he can't catch the football. And so they're going to have to, if that's going to be the case, I wouldn't expect the Saints to do anything different. Like, hey, we're for the Chiefs. Why not we do the same thing and see if it works? So I think that's going to be their biggest challenge. Can they handle those extra rushers up the middle more so than anything with a backup center who doesn't have maybe the experience of a Drew Dahlman or a Kirk Cousins to make those line protections and calls at the line of scrimmage?
Yeah, for sure. And that's gonna be a great matchup to watch, is that Falcons interior offense, the Saints interior defense. Saints interior defense has struggled a little bit in the run game, but in terms of generating pressure, they've been pretty solid. And really,
well, I mean, that's another thing too. Like you're talking about, like, okay, which quarterback, like, or which defensive line, I guess, do you have more faith in getting pressure, and which quarterback do you think will struggle more with pressure? And like I said earlier, like I think Cousins, just his physical limitations from what we've seen so far. I mean, no doubt about it. He was physically incredibly limited against Pittsburgh, and he's looked better, but he's certainly not looking as spry as he has been. So it's hard to imagine Cousins dealing, just physically moving around the pocket with pressure very well.
Really, the Saints have done a good job at ticking up pressure on the pass rush side. Carl Granderson and Chase Young have kind of taken over as the two primary pass rushers, with Cam Jordan's kind of seeing his snaps tick back a little bit. He's helping out on the interior a bit as well. But those two guys are both at 18 pressures generated so far. So they're both tied for the most, third most pressures by individual players right now in the NFL. And then Brian Brzee, the second-year defensive tackle, he's coming off of a 2-sack game. He's been really disruptive so far this season. And the Saints may be getting defensive tackle Colin Saunders back as well, veteran who used to play with the Kansas City Chiefs. So this could end up lining up to being one of those situations where, while Atlanta's offensive line, much like New Orleans' offensive line, is losing in terms of health, the Saints' defensive line is coming in with a little bit extra oomph, if you will, going into this week.
Yeah, and I've watched a couple of Saints games at this point, and I know Demario Davis isn't wreaking the same usual havoc. He's
kind of been banged up. Demario was banged up in the back half of last game, so Demario, usually an Iron Man, I'm usually not hurt at all, as he was kind of hurt in training camp, and now he's kind of dealing with some I don't want to say injuries, because I don't know if it's like, I don't know how serious it is, but he certainly is not at 100%.
Usually reeks as a blitzer, but he's had so much success against the Falcons, so it wouldn't shock me if this is necessarily his breakout game to sort of be that guy that can blow up Bijan in the backfield and whatnot.
Yeah, big player to watch too. Also on the injury report on Wednesday, as it did not participate, player dealing with, I believe it's a hamstring injury, if I remember correctly. He went into the injury tent super late in the game. We thought maybe he was just getting something taped up, but definitely a big one to watch with him not participating. But I will say this, he's probably going to be on the field. This is a guy that's very hard to keep off the field. But like if he's on the field and hampered, that's going to be a different story. So a big one to watch there for sure.
Yeah. Last tidbit before we talk about the Falcons defense, I do wonder a little bit about whether or not Kyle Pitts is going to have a big game. He had a big catch.
Yeah.
He never has a big game. I mean, he never does. And I know, coming off of the Dallas Goedert game, a lot of people are going to be like, well, I mean, obviously tight ends is how you get after the Saints. Kyle Pitts, what he had one long catch against the Chiefs, and that was it. Then he had like 2 for, like I said, no notes here, but wasn't it like 2 for 50? But one of the catches was like a 39-yarder or something somewhere in there
last week. But we went into this Chiefs game being like, hey, the Chiefs have given up more catches and more yards to tight ends than pretty much any team. And Kyle Pitts, outside of really that one play, wasn't a huge contributor. Obviously, the Saints are coming off a game where Dallas Goedert kind of cooked them in that game.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're sitting here wondering with the Falcons, like, okay, well, last week wasn't the big Kyle Pitts breakout game. Maybe it's this week. So what are your
I also think a lot of the times when, like, that's an easy, it's easy to say that. It makes sense. But also think about it like this. Like, if the defense gives up 170 yards to a tight end, you would think the emphasis this week is going to be on stopping the tight end throughout practice. We saw it with the Cowboys on Thursday night, where the Cowboys give up whatever it is, 350, 400 yards of rushing to the Ravens, and then immediately their big emphasis is stopping the run against the Giants. Now, yeah, totally different situation with the Giants and the Ravens, but you can see how that, sometimes when you see a huge hole in the defense play out in one game, you immediately see the swing back. So I would say, if anything, the Goddard game is going to hurt the chances for Pitts, because now the defense is like, all right, we cannot do this again. We cannot allow 200 yards to a tight end again.
thoughts on the Saints' ability to deal with someone like Kyle Pitts?
Yeah, look, it's going to be a challenge. I mean, look, they just gave up 170 receiving yards to Dallas Goedert, and 61 of them came all on one play. But still, that's a lot to end up giving up in terms of what you're trying to do there. And the Saints had recently gotten better up against tight ends over the course of the past couple of years. But this year so far, they've given up the third most yards, 217. You're just 2 spots behind those Kansas City Chiefs that you mentioned, 2 tight ends. So they kind of gotten better up against tight ends over the course of the past couple of years. But this year so far, they've given up the third most yards, 217. You're just 2 spots behind those Kansas City Chiefs that you mentioned.
But I mean, if Dallas Goedert is 170 of those 217 yards, so you're telling me that through 2 weeks we gave up about 20-ish, 25-ish yards a game to tight ends? Like, I mean, I don't know. It's a 3-week sample size with one enormous outlier. So I'm not a data analyst expert here, but I would probably throw that out. That's a totally different situation than giving up like 80 yards a game versus giving up 25, 25, and 170.
2 tight ends. So they kind of taken maybe a little bit of a step back in that here early on in the season. But it took, 3 guys running into one another. The team only gave up, let me see where they were last year. They were 833. So around the middle of the NFL last year, in terms of receiving yards surrendered to opposing tight ends. So if they're able to kind of get back to what they already have proven to be, then I think that they'll be okay. But I think Kyle Pitts is going to be a big test for them to get there.
Yeah. So when we talk about the Falcons defense, very similar to what's going on with the Saints, can they stop the run, right? The Saints have one game where they had to worry about
All right, let me do some quick math here. Let me do some quick math. So what do you say, 800, let's say 820. So they gave up 820 yards last year, which equals out to about 48 yards a game. And we have, 217 minus 170 47 divided by 2, 23. So last year on average we gave up 48 yards a game to tight ends. This year, let's drop Goddard from 170 to 100 because of the 61-yard chunk play. So let's say instead of 217, we've given up 147 to Goddard. If you take out the 70-yard kind of chunk play, so then we've given up 147 yards a game. Divide that by 3, and you get 49. So, I mean, this is a quick back of the napkin math, but last year we averaged 48 yards a game to tight ends. This year, if you take out the 61, we rounded to the 70. If you take out the 70-yard chunk play to Goddard, then we're giving up 49 yards a game. So that just goes to show you how sometimes with numbers, and when you're doing this like big amalgamation of numbers to get an average, you kind of want to take out the top end and bottom end if there's outliers on both sides, and to give you more of a true number. So like it's obvious, like 217 divided by 3. 217 divided by 3 is 72 yards. The Saints last year gave up 47 yards a game. With the outlier, all of a sudden that goes to 72 yards. You take out the outlier, which we're not taking out Dallas Goedert's performance. We're taking out the 61-yard chunk play, which was a busted coverage, which, you take out that one play, all of a sudden, this kind of weird average turns into basically a carbon copy of what the average was last year. So that, I mean, I think it's important because we talk about analytics and stats and deep dives and how you kind of look at the game differently, but there's so many caveats to that. Like, this is a great example of how, and not that they're doing anything wrong, but just like a base, like taking the stats without context and without doing a little bit of extra work, it could all of a sudden look bad. Like you could easily say, well, the Saints give up 75 yards receiving to a tight end this year. I mean, a game. Kyle Pitts is about to have a huge game. But like I said, you take out that random chunk play that shouldn't have happened, then it's like they give up 48 yards, which is about what they always do. So if they're always pretty good against tight ends, they've shown they're pretty good against tight ends right now. And it's hard to say the Saints have been about how they always have against tight ends when you just had a guy go for 170. But that's part of that's part of looking at these games with your head, not your heart.
The run defense, the Falcons have had every game where they've had to worry about their run defense. Everybody's been pretty successful running the football, but especially these last 2 weeks against Philadelphia, against Kansas City, basically what those teams did is they forced the Falcons to play a lot of nickel with 3 wide receivers, and they just kind of ran it down their throats. And I wonder if the Saints are going to try to repeat that. They tried that last week, seemingly against Philadelphia, because the Falcons had so much success doing that against the Eagles defense. So it looked like the Saints were playing a lot more with those 3 wide receiver sets and trying to run the football. And it didn't quite work because I think Philadelphia, they probably listened to the Locked On Falcons podcast where I made fun of.
I'd have to go back and look at the all-22, but I feel like they didn't run a lot out of the 3 wide receiver sets. I feel like the 3 wide receiver sets were more on passing situations. I may be wrong about that, but I feel like they didn't run as much as they should have out of this set.
Their team and saying they're too soft up front. They don't have enough up front. And they put more beef up front last week, and they were able to shut down the Saints run game. And so I wonder if the Falcons will make a similar adjustment to put more beef on the football field to try to stop this Saints run game, given some of the issues that they're dealing with at that position. Or do the Saints just go back to, hey, we're going to go back to what we like to do, which is put the fullback out there, put the multiple tight ends, and we'll run the football. We'll, use play action as potent as it was against that Dallas Cowboys team. I kind of like that strategy a little bit better for the Falcons defense, even though it may play to the same strength, just because I think it also plays to the strength of the Falcons, where you can get more bigger bodies out there, be a little bit stouter against the run, and maybe get more Grady Jarrett, more David Onyemata, some of these other interior D linemen against some of these question marks on the Saints offensive line. But there is a give and take there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the Saints ran nine times out of 11 personnel last week, out of the 20, I believe it was 29 total rushes that they had. And they only got 3.9 yards per carry out of those. So even when they went to that, and look, Aaron, all those came after Eric McCoy had his injury. 5 of those 9 runs all happened in the second half of the game, all this other stuff. So it just wasn't working for them, even when they tried to go lighter. So it was tough for them when they went heavy. Philly stacked the defensive line with 6 players and 1 hovering linebacker over the top that took away a lot of the double teams that New Orleans was able to do on those outside runs. You know how important those double teams are in those outside zone runs. And so they were having a lot of trouble doing that. And then they weren't able to run an 11. Like it was a big deal for them. And so the question mark becomes how much of it was that Philly specifically had a great day, especially with the awesome day that their big defensive tackle had. Or is it that the Saints weren't able to protect the run because of their own deficiencies? And
I think it was a perfect storm. I think it was a perfect storm where Fangio basically said, we're going to stop the run. We are not going to let you pass. Or we're not going to let you, we're going to stop the run. We're going to force you to pass. And I think the Saints were in a situation where because of Taysom's injury, because of McCoy's injury, they were just stuck to where they were like, we can't really adjust out of this. We don't really have the horses right now to do this. They got caught with their pants down, and Kubiak was just kind of winging it. And I think, unfortunately, it turned into one of those games where the game script kind of said, look, run the ball, kill the clock, shorten the game, try and win at the end, which is what they did until the 61-yard pass to Dallas Goedert. So Kubiak, I think he saw a line to victory, and it almost worked. Now, it was ugly, and you could argue that if Allen doesn't punt on the 40 and lets Groupie kick it, you know, like that's kind of out of Kubiak's hand, but that's something else that kind of changed the game. So even though it wasn't a pretty line to victory, it kind of was the right line, because it was just like, okay, if we can somehow turn this game into just a muck it up and end it as fast as possible, we might be able to squeak out of here with a win. And like I said, with a minute left, it worked.
And so Atlanta is going to be a big sort of education in which one of those is the correct issue.
Okay. And I'm curious, what are some of the other things that you're looking at with this Saints offense going up against this Falcons defense this week?
What I'm looking at is Chris Olave, because Chris Olave, I think, was the answer last week that should have been used more. Atlanta is bad against stopping wide receiver ones, so it should be the time to unleash Chris Olave. I think Chris Olave has a huge game.
I mean, I think one of the big things is going to be those 2 safeties. I mean, Justin Simmons.
It'll also be interesting to see if Taysom is back, to see how much different the offense just looks. You know, Taysom, I think, being out limited the play sheet, like how deep he could get into the playbook. With Taysom back, we might see a little bit more of that creativity.
So, of course, the Saints also pursued, as well as Jesse Bates, 2 of the best safeties in the NFL, one of the best safety tandems in the NFL. Plus, you've got A.J. Terrell on the outside there, like very, very good secondary. And that's being coached by very, very good coaches that get very, very good play out of the secondary. So I think that's going to be the other thing is, look, New Orleans is going to want to run the football for sure, but they also need to be able to throw, right? That's going to be a big piece of it. And so are they going to be able to match up against this Atlanta secondary that's got a lot of talent? I think that the Saints have a lot of talent at wide receiver as well. I just think that it's good on good. You know what I mean? And that's where we get to see some really fun and good football, I would say.
Absolutely. So we will see which team shows up and has the good football, but we'll break down some things on what we think are like the 3 things that can allow them to play that good football this Sunday as we wrap up today's crossover Thursday. So, Ross, we are talking about the things that these teams have to do in order to win football games, also known as keys to victory. And what are 3 that you think the New Orleans Saints have to do this Sunday to emerge with a win?
Run the football, stop the run, and get Chris Olave involved, I would say, are the big 3.
Yeah, I think my biggest thing is find a way to run the football. And a good way to do that is to get Taysom Hill involved a bunch. Taysom has been the kind of Falcons kryptonite and everything at times. He should be back and healthy. So I think that he has to play a big role in getting that run game going. They're going to have to you're going to have to get after Kirk Cousins with the pass rush as well. Keep him uncomfortable, keep him making some bad decisions or force him into making some bad decisions if they can. And then lastly, number 3 for me is generate explosive plays on offense, while of course limiting them on defense. New Orleans has done a good job of both of those things. In some cases, when they haven't, that's when they've lost.
Yeah, for me, the Falcons, it's the first thing is someone's got to control the line of scrimmage in this game, and hopefully it's the
Falcons are the same, right? The Falcons are run the football. Then the Falcons' next step is to exploit the offensive line weakness for the Saints. And those are like that. I mean, that's the two biggest things for both teams. 100%. Like, that's where this is all going to start. If you want to, like, at the beginning of the game, if you see one team being able to run the football and the other team not, like that probably is going to tell you who's going to win.
Atlanta Falcons that do that on either side of the ball with establishing a run, stopping the run game, and making one of these teams play in a way left-handed that they don't want to necessarily play. And then the second thing to me is don't be a bozo, referring to Kirk Cousins, right? Don't turn the ball over. Don't do the bozo stuff that Kirk Cousins, the chaos that Kirk Cousins occasionally has in this matchup. And then the third thing is I want to see if this coaching staff can make the adjustments to get better play in some of these areas of deficiency that we discussed on today's episode. But
that's Ross, a great call.
Kicking it back to you. You know, I was hoping that we would go entire crossover Thursday episode without the Taysom Hill name being dropped on the podcast. And unfortunately, we had to do it. But what is Taysom Hill's role in the Saints' new look offense under Clint Kubiak? What are you expecting from him this weekend?
Well, he certainly is the key to kind of all these different looks. He's the key to this mismatch nightmare for defenses where Taysom's lining up at tight end, at fullback, at halfback, at quarterback. No one knows where he's going. You always have to account for him. He's also the key for these like 3rd and 1s, 4th and 1s, where we saw last game a lot of 3rd and 1, 4th and 1s didn't go our way. But if Taysom is in there, it's hard to imagine that we're not more successful there. So he is a much bigger piece of this offense than I think he's given credit.
Can I answer the question about what his role is by simply saying yes? That's kind of what his role has been so far this season. He'll take snaps at running back, he'll take snaps at fullback, tight end, wide receiver, in the slot, quarterback. Like, they'll just fold him in everywhere. And then he's on both kick and punt return and coverage units as well. They missed him last week up against the Philadelphia Eagles. That would have been a massive help, especially after losing Eric McCoy, to just have that extra juice in the run game in terms of what it is that he's able to provide. Look, Alvin Kamara missed Wednesday's practice with a hip/ribs injury. I think he'll probably be fine by the time that the actual weekend rolls around, but just a big one to watch. And if he's hampered in any way, or if he's not able to go, it's not only Jamal Williams, the backup running back, that ends up being called upon. It's Taysom Hill that's going to be called upon in that run game. So I would expect him to be somebody that ends up getting the ball quite often from a variety of different ways. But I expect that it's mostly going to be his involvement would mostly be in the run game, although he still has the option to go out there and run, or not the option, but is still called upon to go out there and run routes and things like that as well.
Yeah. And, you know, on that third key to victory that I suggested about making adjustments, basically what I mean
such a good one, by the way,
is, you know, my worry with the Atlanta Falcons is that, you know, they're going to be this team that is we're going to run what we're going to run, and it's up to our opponent to stop us. And
that is not where you want to be.
I would like to see the team do things differently, right? It's the idea of, like, if you're a team and you do A, B, and C well, and then, you know, injuries take away B, and then you're playing an opponent that can also take away C, can you make that adjustment, and just instead of just relying on doing A well, you can also now add D and E and F to your repertoire. And I think if the Falcons can show that they can do that, given some of the concerns we have with the run game, you know, and not being able to rely as much on the outside zone scheme with their ability to stop the run, that to me is going to be a big key to not only their success on Sunday, but throughout the rest of the season, because that's going to be something that you're going to need to do as the season wears on, because attrition and injuries and all these various things and different matchups are going to affect you. And I think for me, that's the one lingering question I have with this new Falcons coaching staff on how good are they at making some of these adjustments, because in both of their losses to the Pittsburgh Steelers and Kansas City Chiefs, it felt like both of those teams, especially
the Steelers, was a big one because they just didn't adjust to the TJ Watt factor. Like, they were just allowing Kirk Cousins to get annihilated, and we covered that back when it happened about they didn't take a single snap. I don't think they took a single snap out from under center. Was that it? Or they didn't have any play action. Like, everything was out of the pistol or the shotgun. It was just a mess.
Those defenses kind of figured out what the Falcons were doing midway through the game, and the Falcons really weren't able to kind of make those in-game adjustments to figure something out to sort of counter what those defenses were doing. So I think that's going to be important this week, especially going up against another very good defense under a very good defensive coordinator in head coach in Dennis Allen.
Yeah, it's funny. This is now the moment where a lot of Saints fans that are listening go, "Wait, is he talking about the Falcons or is he talking about the Saints?" Because like this is one of those things that happens when you get into sort of the business of the wide zone offense. And both of these teams dealt in that sort of black market over the course of this offseason, and getting Zach Robinson over in Atlanta, having Clint Kubiak here in New Orleans. There's a lot of that mentality of just going to run what they run and win with it. And that's going to be the idea. And I think Saints fans kind of got introduced to that a little bit last week, to where, they were running what they were running. It wasn't working. Then they ran what they typically run, but they ran it out of something else and it still didn't work. And they didn't really have another avenue to go to. And then the big question mark became, is that an inability to adjust, an unwillingness to adjust, which is very common around the NFL. I wish that people really realize how common that is, that most teams go in and say, this is the identity, we're not changing, and don't really make those big wide swath change of direction adjustments. They make sort of smaller tweaks and things like that throughout a game. But we saw that with New Orleans. And so the big question was it injury driven, or was it like this is sort of part of what it is to have a wide zone offense?
Like I said, I think it was kind of a perfect storm.
And so it's going to be really interesting to see both of these teams potentially end up in that same situation again this week, to where one of them will have to adjust. Who adjusts best might be the one that ends up walking away with the victory.
Yeah, definitely. Ross, I think that's where we can kind of end this cross.
I'm not going to lie, guys. Like, the more we talked about it today, like, the more I've kind of worked myself into a shoot here, where I don't see the line of victory for the Falcons. I don't see how they win this game. I mean, the more you talk about it, like, yeah, the Saints are definitely hurt on the offensive line, but the Falcons are hurt more. Yeah, the Saints have, difficulty running the football. So do the Falcons. Okay, well, then what happens next? They got to throw. Well, the Falcons are really bad at stopping the first wide receiver. The Saints are really good. Okay, advantage Saints. If the defense is supposed to adjust to, now that the book is out on the Saints, like the Eagles have given the blueprint on how to beat the Saints, I would think the Chiefs have given the blueprint for how to beat the Falcons. And which defensive coordinator do I trust more to make the game plan? I would say Dennis Allen's the better coordinator between him and Raheem Morris. Who do I trust to, if the offensive line is bad, which quarterback do I trust to deal with pressure more? I would say Derek Carr. Kirk Cousins is physically not there. I mean, he's been physically bad. So I just don't see the line of victory for the Falcons. The line of victory for the Falcons is all of a sudden Darnell Mooney. Like, I don't know, man. And you might say, like, well, they'll be able to run it. I say, well, what evidence do I have? What evidence do I have that they will be able to run it? And then you say, oh, Drake London. Well, we just talked about it. Drake London is probably going to get shut down because the Saints are third best in the NFL at taking away the wide receiver one. So you just kind of, I mean, the more I think about it, the more it's like I just do not see the advantage that the Falcons have. What is the advantage? I mean, I'm not saying the Falcons are going to be easy or it's going to be a pushover or that the Falcons don't have good players, but I do not see the line of victory for the Falcons. I see the line of victory for the Saints. The line of victory for the Saints is net negative, or, the offensive line issues, net negative. Neither team will be able to run the football the way they want to, but the Falcons' defense is much worse than the Saints. So if there were a defense that was to allow a little bit of taking advantage of them, it would be the Saints taking advantage of the Falcons' defense, not the Falcons taking advantage of the Saints' defense, because of the discrepancy in how good the defenses have been. And then if you take that away and say, I can obviously see Chris Olave having a big game because the Falcons are really bad at covering the wide receiver one. I cannot see Drake London having a big game. So you're telling me that the line to victory for the Saints is take advantage of a worse defense / get your best player arguably the ball, but the Falcons' line of victory is through Darnell Mooney? Because it's hard to say the defense. They've been 22nd in they're 22nd against the pass, 22nd against the run. It's hard to say the offense, right? Their two starting offensive linemen are out. So it's hard to be like, oh, they'll just run it down the Saints' throat. Will they? Because once those linemen went out, they certainly didn't do that against Kansas City. So what evidence do you have for that? I don't know. The more I'm listening, the more I'm thinking the Saints kind of have all the advantage here. Get on down there. Let me know in the comments below. This was a long one today. If you made it to the end, thank you very much. I do appreciate it. and I will see you in the next